The NBA trade deadline is just a week and a half away, and although there are some teams in the league that don't really need to make any moves, these 5 teams absolutely need to make a trade. We begin with the Boston Celtics, a team that I had relatively high hopes for coming into the season. I thought that given some of their offseason moves, bringing in players like Dennis Schroeder on good value, bringing in Al Horford, the potential development of Robert Williams, alongside the obvious talent of Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, I thought this would be a team that would at least be in the running for a top 5 or 6 seed in the Eastern Conference, even with the improvement of some of the other teams in the conference. But here's a crazy stat about Boston. This is just a 500 basketball team, and it has been for 2 full years now. Like, this is the definition of an average team. And as a result, you might be thinking that the move that Boston needs to make is splitting up Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. I don't necessarily think that's the case. The move for me would be all of the pieces around those 2 guys. I'm not at the point yet for Boston of trying to split these guys up and deciding already that their games are not going to mix well together. I would exhaust all of the other options outside of those 2 players in terms of trades, trying to make this roster work. Because when you look at the roster and you look at the history of Brown and Tatum in Boston, it's much more likely that the problem with them and the reason that they're only a 500 team has way more to do with factors outside of those 2 guys than it does with those 2. And so I would take the approach of just waiting this out. Maybe eventually you will have to split them up, but I don't think the time is now. And really what they need is they need a point guard. They need a setup guy, someone that can create on the perimeter, allow Brown and Tatum to be off the ball a little bit more. The problem is those guys are relatively hard to find right now. So what I would advocate for is to finally make the Marcus Smart move. Move him somewhere else for someone that helps you more offensively, allows you to get into a little bit better of a flow, and is just a better all-around offensive player. In terms of targets, I would be looking at someone like Bogdan Bogdanovic from Atlanta. That's a trade we've talked about in a previous video. Buddy Hield from Sacramento, Karis LeVert from Indiana. I know that those aren't the most inspired names, but in this current market, if you're looking for a perimeter creator player, which I think is what Boston needs, those are pretty much the options. One other piece to keep an eye on for Boston, as well as a variety of teams around the league, is Goran Dragic, who would be the kind of perimeter playmaker creator type that would help a team like Boston or like Dallas or any other team that needs a true lead guard. But there's a couple of problems with that if you're Boston. This obviously is a move that only helps you this season, doesn't help you into the future whatsoever. There's a little bit of redundancy there between Dragic and Schroeder, despite him being a better playmaker and spacer. And ultimately, it probably doesn't really move the needle for you that much this year anyway. Maybe you go up a few spots in the standings, but I do think it illustrates how difficult it is to find the exact kind of player that Boston's really looking for here, given their situation. Next up now is no surprise, and it is the Portland Trailblazers. And it does seem like a lot of doom and gloom around this team right now, with Damian Lillard being out for presumably most of the rest of the season. CJ McCollum has been in and out of the lineup. It's a team that they might be the 10th seed again, but it's clear that whatever era they've had in the past, that era is winding down. But the real positive for Portland so far this season has been the emergence of Anthony Simons and him developing into a really dynamic perimeter player with Lillard and with CJ McCollum out, and giving them a real piece to kind of look forward to and build towards. The biggest issue, though, is that he's a restricted free agent at the end of the season, and that can kind of complicate how you want to build your team around, say, moving forward. But I do think that it's clear that having him on the roster makes it much easier to move on from someone like, for example, CJ McCollum. We've talked about Portland a ton in the past as it relates to Damian Lillard. I don't see that move coming from them, at least within the next handful of months, certainly not before this deadline, because he has said time and time again that he wants to stay in Portland. And so if you want to do that and you want to try and build some kind of second era around Dame, that largely revolves around getting assets in exchange for CJ McCollum and plugging Anthony Simons into that CJ McCollum role. And ideally what you need is an impactful two-way wing that can guard, that can shoot, that can create a little bit as well. The problem is everybody else in the league needs that too. I've talked in the past about how I think they'd be a really interesting Ben Simmons option, and I think CJ McCollum is an asset that Philadelphia would potentially be interested in. I don't know what other assets they would have to put in to make that move work, but that's certainly one to take a look at. If it's not a wing, maybe you can get a really impactful big, someone like Sabonis, someone like Miles Turner from Indiana, someone that really helps you offensively and defensively as well. But ultimately, it just comes down to starting to think about past this season and probably moving on from CJ McCollum. Next up now is the Atlanta Hawks, a team that is really difficult to figure out, because they make the Eastern Conference Finals last year, and then they come into this year with all these expectations. They're going to be one of the top seeds in the East. And basically nothing has gone right. They've had players in and out due to injuries and protocol issues. And offensively, they've been fantastic, but they just can't find a way to guard at all. And they've already made some moves. They dumped Cam Reddish, but there's just not a lot of clarity with this roster. And it's really difficult trying to balance the present with the future. You don't want to just give up on this team this year, a team that made the conference finals last year, but you also want to look towards the future with a roster that is still, for the large part, really, really young. And so if we're operating under the assumption that they need to kind of do both, they need to get assets that help them into the future, but also can help their team this season, they need a stabilizing wing presence, because when DeAndre Hunter is hurt, and he's hurt a lot of the time, they don't have wing defenders. They don't really have much defense apart from some occasional rim protection. And so they need a stabilizing force, similar to what PJ Tucker was for Milwaukee last year, but on a completely different level, because that was a veteran team that was pushing for a championship and ultimately won a championship. But what about Jeremy Grant as an option for Atlanta? You could look at possibly moving one of the bigs, whether it be Capella or Kungwu. You could look at potentially swapping Kevin Huerter out. Maybe you combine this with some kind of Marcus Smart move where it's like Bogdanovich goes somewhere and you get Smart and Jeremy Grant. Those guys play alongside Trae Young. Something similar to that, but I do think that it's clear they need to make some kind of move. They need to get two-way players, and Grant would be a nice fit in terms of this season as well as into the future, assuming you can continue to re-sign him. The logic behind moving one of the bigs, especially to a team like Detroit, would be you still have one of them, whether it be Capella or Kungwu, and then you can play John Collins at the 5 more. You can kind of space out these lineups a little bit more around Trae Young, and I think that would be an interesting option to explore. Second to last now is probably the most interesting team of the entire video, and it's the Washington Wizards, who, after a really strong start to the season, have been pretty awful for the last month and a half to 2 months, and that is worst case scenario if you're this organization, because Bradley Beal is a free agent this offseason. I think we continue to forget about it and gloss over it, just assume that he's going to return. But I do think that there's a strong possibility that the way this team is playing right now and Beal's fit within it is going to cause him to leave this offseason, and that would be a complete and utter disaster for Washington if that's the way that it went down. As of the recording of this video, they've lost 5 games in a row. They're under 500 after that strong start to the year. Beal himself hasn't really looked right for most of the year, and they created this flexibility around him by moving Westbrook and bringing in a partner in Dinwiddie for him in the backcourt. But if they can't really start to build something around him, he might start looking elsewhere. And quite honestly, it might be a good idea for them to go ahead and move on from Bradley Beal and get assets for him and start to build a really interesting young team here, because there have been times for Washington this season where with Beal off the floor or with him not playing, they've been a really good team with all these other collective pieces that they have. And if you can get a Jaylen Brown package, for example, in exchange for Bradley Beal, that's an option I would heavily explore if I were them. And then last up is the Sacramento Kings, who really can go in 2 wildly different directions. One, they can break some things down and try and get some assets in exchange for some of their younger players and start to look towards next year or the year after, or they can push for the playoffs. Reportedly, they are absolutely desperate to not only make some kind of move before the deadline or multiple moves, but to push for the postseason this year. And that's a difficult thing to figure out how exactly that would work with this roster. It seems like primarily Buddy Hield and Marvin Bagley are the 2 assets that they're waving around, trying to get someone to take on. Maybe get a wing, maybe get another backcourt player. I'm just not sure what exactly puts this team over the top. Maybe it is Jeremy Grant. Maybe there's a combo 3-4 out there that they can go and get, or maybe they're the Ben Simmons team, but despite the fact that there are reports that they are out now on the Ben Simmons sweepstakes. I understand the mindset of just what it would do for this franchise to make the playoffs. I just don't know what that move is. And if you're asking me, I would certainly look towards the future a little bit more here. I'm all for trying to move Hield and get some assets out of him. I think it was a big loss that they weren't able to move him to LA this offseason. And some kind of shake-up move where they can get some assets for Hield or for Bagley or whatever the case may be. And then you go into next year with some exciting pieces. I still think there can be something there with De'Aaron Fox. If you want to move him, I guess that's fine. Tyrese Halliburton is fun, is interesting. They've got some veterans on this roster as well. There's possibilities for this roster if they start to think about How can we make the playoffs next year or 2 years from now? Because I think it's going to be difficult to make a quote unquote all-in move for the postseason this year, just given the way that this market is shaking out. There's not a ton of instant high impact pieces on the market. But ultimately, just like every other team on this list, I would advocate for some kind of move. Every team on this list needs some kind of shakeup. They need some kind of change. And certainly Sacramento falls into that category.